Hello, I'm Nicholas Wade. I'm the author of The Faith Instinct, a new book about evolution, about religion rather, from an evolutionary perspective.
I'm Razib Khan. I blog at Gene Expression at Science Blogs, and I'm an UNS Foundation Junior Fellow. And I guess first thing that I want to talk about, Nicholas, is your previous book, Before the Dawn. I wouldn't say it's predictable, but just from your writing in the New York Times, it makes sense where it comes from. And The Faith Instinct, that seems a little bit more out of left field, just going by your other work. What would you say to that?
Well, it's certainly not connected with what I write about in the Times, but it does flow out of Before the Dawn, in which I have a short section on religion. And it seems to me in writing that book that religion plays such an important role in early societies that it would be worth devoting a whole book to that.
Sure. Well, I mean, it's obviously an important topic, but I guess what I would ask is just a lot of people wouldn't consider it an evolutionary topic, right?
No, I think that's the fresh angle that I brought to bear in the Faith Instinct by showing, I hope one can make a reasonably plausible argument that it does have an evolutionary basis.
Okay. When I went to, I recently went to Amazon.com just to check the reviews for your book, and there were some good reviews and there were some negative reviews, and I found the negative reviews interesting because some of the commenters on those reviews were claiming that the negative reviews arose because you're English and you wrote a book on religion, and it wasn't what the reviewers were expecting from someone of your national origin when it came to religion, because Chris Hitchens and Dawkins have already written books. And this is Dawkins is an evolutionary biologist, but this is a very, very different book, much more evolutionary in orientation than either of those, right?
Yes, I think so.
Yeah.
Dawkins' book is is mostly an attack on religion, and he dismisses the idea that religion could have been favored by natural selection.
Yeah. And like, in normal situations, he's obviously a big fan of natural selection, but here there's somewhat of an exception to that rule. So in terms of religion, obviously it's the centerpiece of the book as a trait. I want to ask you, how do you imagine it as a trait? Like, as I was reading your book, I was thinking of it as a quantitative trait with a distribution, but sometimes you would say things which implied that it was universal across humans, so that we all have the same predispositions maybe, and there's no variation. I mean, can you clarify that?
I'm sure. I think it is a universal trait. It's like language.
Okay.
It's built into everyone's neural circuits, and it's a sort of standard part, as it were, of human nature.
Okay,
there may be variation, but the variation is in secondary qualities, like in religiosity, which is sort of.
So I mean, basically, you would think it's like a competency. It's a core competency of humans in terms of the ability to conceptualize supernatural agents and engage in religious activity and ritual.
Yes, I think the competency is the instinct to learn the religion of one's community and to commit to it emotionally at a particular age, at the age of puberty, when emotional initiation rites occur. So, and that's sort of analogous to the instinct to learn a language. If you don't learn religion at that stage, then you probably never do.
Okay, so you're saying that there's a critical period like language. That's how you're imagining it.
Yes, there is a critical window analogous to language, and if you don't learn religion, then probably you'll never become very religious.
Well, have you looked at the social science data in terms of religious change to make that inference in terms of okay, let's say because there's been just some recent work that got published on people with no religion, and it looked at the churn among them, and I think something like 40% of people with no religion claim a religion as an adult, with a slightly higher proportion of women than men, with somewhat higher proportion in terms of defection rates, in terms of switching. So, I mean, what would you say to something like that?
Well, that's a very interesting finding, of which I wasn't aware. But I think what's happening is that because we have an instinct for religion built into us. People who do not embrace an organized religion, many of them spend their lives in some sort of search for spirituality, for some sort of alternative religion.
Okay. So I mean, going back to the critical period, during the critical period, like what would be happening with someone like that? Would they have would they just have like a specific set of intuitions that aren't channeled into organized religious outlets?
Well, for whatever reason, they would reject the organized religion of their community. Maybe they didn't find it intellectually satisfying. Maybe they just didn't believe the ground rules, so they would reject it.
Okay. So basically, it's you're analogizing it to language, but you do acknowledge that there could be, because with language, the difference between that I'm thinking with language and religion is I mean, I've met plenty of people. I mean, I would probably fall into that category myself, where religious intuitions aren't very attractive or don't make much sense and never really have. But when it comes to language, when people can't learn language or lack the ability to like create, grammar or syntax very quickly, it's a pathology. You know what I'm saying?
Right.
So it just seems like with religion, there's more of a spectrum. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yes, indeed. I in no way do I wish to imply that being an atheist is a pathology.
So I mean, I don't have a problem if you're saying that. I'm just saying that, like, in terms of the discontinuity, it doesn't seem as striking to me. It seems like there's more of a just a gradual shift along the spectrum. But maybe that's just how we conceptualize language. I don't know.
Yes, language is sort of more all or nothing, and if you don't, in the very rare cases of feral children or children brought up by parents who didn't speak to them, if they don't learn the language in that window, then they never learn it perfectly. I think you can see something analogous happening in religion, and people don't become committed to an organized religion at a very early age. Then they never really commit to a religion, even though they may still be searching for one.
Okay. So we've been talking about religion a lot, and I just realized I'm going to jump ahead a little, and maybe we should just bring up what you mean by religion, because when you say religion, that means different things to different people. You've been referring specifically to organized religion right here, and we've kind of been talking about that. That makes sense. But could you talk about the different components of religion, which you address kind of in sequence in the book, but just when you're talking about religion, what do you mean? And in terms of the faith instinct, how it relates to an instinct towards these different components.
Well, I do perhaps rashly give a definition of religion in the first chapter based on my analysis of its evolutionary origins. But I think the essential dynamics of religion are that there is a supernatural world, a sort of parallel universe in which the gods or supernatural beings live. But there is an interaction between the supernatural world and our real world. And in this two-way interaction, we try and manipulate the gods by prayer and sacrifice. And they, for their part, send down laws that must be obeyed for fear of divine punishment. So that is the essence of religion, and that sets up, in effect, an invisible government, very important for primitive societies, in which the laws necessary, the laws and rules and customs necessary for the society's survival in the opinion of its members are imputed to the gods. They then become divine rules, not human rules, and people obey them with great care. I think that's the essence of religion, and that is the definition of it.
Okay, so basically, from what I can understand there, then you start out with basic psychology, with some psychological intuitions, and then you're scaling that into a social group where everyone shares the same intuitions, and they can use those intuitions to construct social order. Is that kind of what you're getting at there?
Yes, I think that's right. I mean, I distinguish between the personal side of religion and the social side. So religion has to be personally attractive, otherwise people wouldn't practice it, and natural selection couldn't see it. But the aspect of religion that natural selection sees is the social aspect. Okay, and that's I would say it's probably one of your more interesting arguments there.
In the faith instinct, if I understand you correctly, first you do think that the faith instinct or the propensity towards religion is an adaptation that's been driven by natural selection, and you seem to be relying on biological level group selection to drive the fixation of the trait. Is that correct?
Well, I like group selection, and I think it provides a very sort of understandable, attractive explanation. I'm not wedded to it simply because it's a matter of controversy among biologists, which I cannot presume to settle in the book.
Yeah.
All I know is that we are a very social species, and we have very many social instincts, by which I mean sort of behaviors that are more evidently in society's interest than the individual. So these behaviors range from blushing, for example, when you tell a whopping lie, and against your conscious will, you sort of advertise it to the community by blushing, and they go all the way up to sacrificing your life as a soldier in defense of your society. So by whatever means these social behaviors came around, then religion too, I think, developed. Now, evolutionary biologists are not agreed on how these social mechanisms evolved in us, but I'll take group selection as being one of the better explanations on the table, and if that's not it, then it's something else.
Okay, so basically you're rather convinced as an adaptation in terms of how the adaptation emerged. You're a little more open to different avenues then.
Sure. I'm not wedded to group selection. It's just the sort of best mechanism that I can see in the literature at this time.
Okay, so I mean, just listening to you explain that, I would say, like, are you in terms of religion? Do you think this is just a subset of the problem of altruism in some ways, in terms of like how human social groups can maintain themselves in the face of selfish interests?
Well, I think accounting for religion is analogous to accounting for altruism, in that it's another instance of an individual putting society's interests ahead of his own. So it's the same basic challenge to evolutionary theory.
Okay. Yeah, and but the thing is, a lot of researchers in this area, or at least a subset of researchers in this area, do not believe it's an adaptation, right? Like, they think it's a byproduct, basically you could say it's a spandrel, right?
Right.
It's just that religious intuitions emerge as basically misfires of useful intuitions, like agency detection. Like, It's really good that we detect agents, so we imagine that there are a lot more agents out there than there are, because false positive isn't that big of a deal compared to a false negative, in terms of if there's someone there and you think there's no one there, and then they kill you, right? So why would you say that those arguments are not persuasive to you?
This is a position put forward by Scott Atran and Pascal Boyer.
Yeah.
I find those explanations sort of singly pallid and uncompelling. Excuse me.
Okay.
Because religion is such a sort of powerful force in society, particularly in primitive societies. It just seems so very unlikely to be an accident, and it is extremely costly. And if you look at Australian Aborigines, many of their rituals last for months on end. So any society that devoted all that time to warfare instead of religion would surely have an enormous competitive advantage. So something that costly must be conveying enormous benefits, or it would be strongly selected against.
But I mean, wouldn't you say, so like, back to the specific ideas of Atran and Boyer, I mean, they're specifically focusing on psychology in terms of, rather than say group level, like sociology or just like, culture as a whole, right? Like, I mean, could it be that the intuitions themselves, that the psychological atoms that the whole, molecule of religion is constructed out of, that those could be structural byproducts that are co-opted into an adaptive form? Because obviously, I mean, you're right. I mean, just in terms of human history and what we know, groups have gone to war under gods, and religious institutions have served as banks, all sorts of other things. So there's obviously a utility there, right? But in terms of the lower level intuitions which they arise from, is it necessary that they have direct connection with those adaptations? Do you see what I'm getting at?
Well, it certainly could be the case, and I think their explanations may be of some historical interest in explaining how this whole sort of psychological package was put together. It may well be that religion sort of draws on our theory of mind in the way we think of gods or impute thoughts and actions to supernatural deities. But it just seems a biological accident, because it's behavior that has sort of endured for at least the last 50,000 years in every known society. So accidents don't have that record of permanence.
Sure. I see what you're saying. Well, I mean, I guess what you're saying is like, if it's an accident or it's a byproduct, you would assume that selection would eventually, reshape it so that it's more finely tuned, right?
Right, and it certainly wouldn't be universal. We have maybe a few societies that had this from time to time, but it wouldn't be a sort of permanent part of human nature as religion clearly is.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, but going back to the intuitions, though, I mean, in terms of the byproduct, the thing, though, is so it's basically the idea is, like, in terms of human social intelligence and whatnot, the combination of social intelligence and, say, folk physics. But these things are all universal, right? Like, they have obvious, concrete, adaptive values. Social intelligence, the ability to model how objects are going to move and stuff like that. So I think the argument isn't, that, like, in terms of, like, saying it's an accident, it's not random, right? It could be just an inevitable byproduct of a particular structure, of the structure of your mind, right? That's what they're trying to get at. And so, I guess what I was just trying to say is, like, it seems like in terms of your ideas, that could be not the direct target of selection, but it could emerge as an inevitable byproduct of other targets of selection, and then it could also be co-opted by higher level, units. So I know it's a mishmash. Like when we're talking about religion, I mean, your definition was rather condensed, but like people, it just kind of sprawls. I mean, you're right. Your religion is ubiquitous, right? And that's why every ancient artifact, if you don't know what it is it's a sacred relic. So let's just move on from that, I guess. Let's see. Do you want to go on, since you referred to Australian Aborigines already? Do you want to talk about just primitive religion, or I don't know if I should use the word primitive, maybe religion, like the original religion among the different hunter-gatherer populations that you surveyed? I thought that was
one of the things I found is that if you look at primitive religion from the point of view of genetics, there are three particular populations whom genetics tells us have been much more isolated than others, maybe very isolated. So this is particularly the case with Australian Aborigines. So there was a recent paper showing that the inhabitants of Australia and Papua, the original inhabitants, had always been there. There were no further arrivals once the first inhabitants had got to Australia. So that was one of the first appearances of behavior in modern humans outside of Africa, and
could you just for the viewers, could you say like how long
they arrived about 45,000 years ago, according to present archaeological evidence, and the genetics tells us that once they got there, no one else arrived, which is surprising because, well, for various reasons, people thought there were many waves of migrations, but in fact, it turns out so far there's only one. No other waves sort of left any genetic trace. So that means when we look at at Australian Aborigines, we are seeing behaviors that may trace right back to the ancestral human population that lived in northeast Africa up to 50,000 years ago. Now, there are two other groups that are also very isolated. One are the Andaman Islanders. The Andaman Islands are a little group of islands off they're stuck out in the Indian Ocean. They're off the coast of Malaya,
Mm-hmm.
as I recall recently. They've long been very isolated. They had a reputation for cannibalism. Everyone sort of left them alone until very recent times. And their genetics also suggests, from mitochondrial DNA, they have a very sort of ancient part of the N haplotype. And the third group, the Kung San, or the Bushmen of the Kalahari Desert, and they have achieved their isolation through a wonderful biological weaponry they've developed, which was that of poisoning their arrows with the chrysalis of two kinds of beetles, and this sort of toxin was very effective and sort of kept other tribes at bay. Now, these three groups have a very similar religion or form of religious practice, which consists in essence of sustained communal dancing that lasts all through the night. And in the course of these communal dances, men go into trance, and in the trance they sort of see their gods. They have direct contact with the supernatural. And the communal dancing has a very powerful emotional effect, and there's something about moving in unison with a large group of people that makes you emotionally identify with the group. So it's a very strong bonding experience. And this seems to have been since it was the practice of these three groups, and since all these elements are shared in common, it's reasonable to me to assume that this too was the religious practice of the ancestral human population some 50,000 years ago.
Okay. So, I mean, in terms of that was interesting. So, in terms of the faith instinct, when you're talking about religion, I mean, in terms of selection and evolutionary history, would you say this was the form of religion that say, selection or adaptation was targeting? Like, this has been religion for most of the history.
Well, that's right.
Yes,
correct? And I think that's exactly what natural selection was targeting, because the groups that behaved in this way, that had a strong religious culture to draw the society together, gained two things. I mean, firstly, they gained from their internal arrangements. They sort of strengthened the moral fabric of their society, because the religion was saying, you must sort of do as you will be done by. You must treat other members of your society in a sort of fair and decent way. So that kind of society is worth fighting for. And at the same time, we know that the pace of warfare among these primitive groups was fairly incessant, and contrary to the views of many archaeologists who've tried to pacify the past so as to make it seem that we alone are sort of wicked people since we're always going to war, the reverse seems to have been the true. The pace of warfare among primitive peoples was just incessant. Although not recognized in many cases by the first anthropology, because the nature of primitive warfare is entirely different from our own. It doesn't consist of pitched battles and long campaigns. It consists simply of sort of going to war every day. And if you go to war every day, the casualties, even if rather low, start to mount up after time. So it was this fierce pace of warfare combined with the internal moral fabric that gave an enormous edge to the societies that practiced religion, and that's how the genes that favored this behavior, in my view, became universal.
Okay, so I mean, it's the genes. I mean, in terms of say like ritual, like the dance, like the communal dances. Like, I mean, so you would say there are genes, you think, like psychological predispositions perhaps, in terms of just like preferring, I mean, just like being attracted to dancing. I mean, like I understand the attraction. I mean, in terms of, the references to William McNeil's book was very interesting. I had to check that book out. It was about what was it? It was about marching, right?
Right.
Yeah. And so, I mean, obviously in a military context, I mean, apparently that's really, really it's a great bonding experience, right? It creates unit cohesion. So I understand that, but you think that there was specific selection targeting that sort of behavior?
Yes, I do. It's a little difficult when you sort of try and deconstruct religion and ask which specific bits of behavior were favored by natural selection. And probably we can't do it because sort of nature doesn't really work the way we think it does. I mean, if you take the incest taboo, for example, and there's surely some innate circuitry that makes us avoid incest, yet the actual the actual sort of rule seems simply to be the people who you grow up with in childhood are not suitable marriage partners. So it's not the rule that nature has applied is somewhat different to the rule we see in our own society.
Sure. It's not like nature is like doing a quick genomic sequence and like, figuring out identity by descent, stuff like that. It's just like the proximate method as long as it works,
so we don't know exactly what natural selection is doing in giving us the religious instinct. We just see the sort of gross behavior. In terms of dance, I think that is something that probably that is certainly part of the package, and that's for a simple reason, which is that, very interestingly, we are the only primate that can entrain our movements to a rhythmic beat. So chimpanzees can't all move together in unison, but it's something that humans do naturally, and it's very sort of tempting to suppose there's some reason why we have this ability.
Sure. And also you referred to like music as well, right? Like these sorts of, there has been a lot of talk in evolutionary anthropology about why people dance or why music exists and whatnot. And I think you're trying to say that it could be just they're parts of religion, correct?
Yes. I mean, religion and music are definitely intimately intertwined. And I think in a broader perspective, you can see them all as forms of communication. It's as if, since we're a very social animal, we needed ways to communicate, and it's as if you can see natural selection trying one experiment after another, and maybe sort of music was the earliest one, and you can express sort of emotions through music, but it sort of breaks down when you're trying to sort of plan a sort of hunt or an ambush or something. So music was then sort of shunted aside, and maybe religion came next, and we had a sort of wordless religion, perhaps, and then that too sort of didn't quite cut it. So that then along came language. So we have these three very interesting systems of communication, all sort of intertwined in some way, and maybe they all co-evolved, or maybe one came before the other. I mean, it's all a matter of speculation, and all one can do, I think, is simply to observe that the three systems are now intertwined and all serve the same function of communication, either of words or emotions.
Sure. I'm thinking, I just had a thought. First of all, I indicated to you earlier that I generally lack the intuitions, I believe. I was raised in a religious family, officially, I guess. My family is Muslim, but in any case, it never really made much sense to me. And now that you're talking about music, I like music, but I'm tone deaf. I'm tone deaf, so I wonder if I just lack some of the basic instincts that would make a lot of religion make sense, since it's subcomponents, or I lack the competencies, perhaps, is what I'm thinking as I'm listening to you. Additionally, a lot of these arguments, they do they're kind of like you read Geoffrey Miller's The Mating Mind. Yeah, and he has arguments for basically why human culture is so elaborate and complex, and it has to do with displays and sexual selection. And I find it interesting because for you, it seems like religion and like just the group level cohesion is a bigger effect. And I don't know what people would think. I mean, like, what people would find more plausible, because it seems like part of it would just be like, in terms of maybe personal dispositions about like how important they think signaling to mates is, versus say like their understanding of how important religion has been to human societies, right? Right.
Well, Jeffrey's book is great fun to read. I just felt that he's sort of taken a good idea and pushed it to an extreme. So I'm not sure if music is. I don't think the sole function of music is for men or women to attract mates, though. I'm happy to accept it plays an important role.
Oh yeah, it surely helps, just from personal experience that I've seen. But anyways, in any case, but in terms of primitive religion or the original religion, like, I mean, that's not where it stopped, right? You have a lot of stuff in your book. I mean, some of the books on religion, like Atran and Boyes, they focus on basically what you would. I mean, I think they basically focus on animism and tribal religion, and they don't get really too much to more complex religions in detail. Like their theory isn't scaled up that far. Maybe in later work that I haven't seen it has, but in your book you do move on to more complex religion. So should we just talk about the tree of religion, because you kind of use not a biological but an evolutionary, like a phylogenetic tree analogy, right? Okay, we're back.
Good.
Okay, so we were talking about the tree of religion?
Right.
So, can you elaborate on that? I think you specifically focused on the monotheisms.
Right. What I tried to do in the book, once I traced the how religion evolved as an evolutionary behavior, I then also tried to follow its cultural emergence. I think our neural circuitry of religion is the same or pretty identical to that of primitive peoples of many generations ago, but obviously the cultural form of our religion is very different, and that's what I try and trace in the book. So the principal change was that these primitive societies, to judge from the ones that survived into the modern era, were all very egalitarian. So there were no headmen or chief. The whole community was the church. There were no priests that interposed themselves between the community and their gods, because anyone could go into a trance and communicate directly with the people, with the beings in the supernatural world. Now, when we settled down in fixed societies, our societies grew much larger and too unwieldy to manage on an egalitarian basis, and they became very hierarchical. And the leaders co-opted religion as the source of their authority, so they would often make themselves the chief priest, and some of them, like the Roman emperors, even made themselves into gods, usually posthumously. And the religion became one in which the priests sort of monopolized access to the gods, which is very necessary to do if you're running an organized religion, because your authority will be undercut if any member of the congregation can open a direct channel to the supernatural. So the priests must be in charge of communications with the supernatural world, and that's how you get this very different pattern of religion that we have today. So now, one of the first uses of religion in settled societies, once they started to practice agriculture, was to get everyone used to the very hard labor, which is very unaccustomed for sort of hunters and gatherers, and for the sort of seasonal labor that was required to get crops in the ground and harvest them at the right time. So that's why many modern religions, or the religions of agricultural societies, are sort of harnessed to agricultural festivals, which you can see reflected in modern religion. So Passover reflects the barley festival of the Canaanite people from whom Jews and Judaism are descended, and of course Eastern Christianity is the same date as Passover. They're both sort of spring agricultural festivals.
Yeah. And so basically, I mean, this is similar to the argument in Jared Diamond's book, right? In terms of the rise of religion, it's agricultural mass societies required more social complexity, and so religion became more complex, right?
Yes, because then in modern religions have a lot of theology, but I think the complexity is because if you no longer have direct access to the deity, which you probably, as societies grow more educated and sophisticated, it's hard to have direct access to the deity. You need to sort of put it, you need to put the period of access in the past. So it's usually a prophet who had access to the deity, who have the prophet's words. I'm speaking just generically. I think this is true of all the monotheisms. And these are the holy text then becomes the principal evidence of the supernatural. So then the text has to be sort of interpreted and often updated for sort of current circumstances. So this is the role of theology. So you can see how sort of culturally religions get more complex, and it reflects essentially the increasing complexity of human societies.
Well, I mean, like we went from the primitive religion, and now that we're talking theology, but doesn't it seem like before, like, theology seems to have arisen during the Axial Age, right? But there was that whole period of priest kings in Egypt, and also like in Sumeria, the priest-run cities. So it seems like you have like a couple of steps here, right? You have like the institutional religion with the priests and doling out sacrifices and rituals and access, but the theological philosophical part came later, right? When you say
yes, that's correct.
So you have like a couple of different layers here. It's like at first the priests didn't really change too much how people conceived of religion. They just maybe doled it out or controlled the means of production, basically.
Right.
But later with what?
Yes, that's right. And they suppressed the communal dancing.
Yeah, and then eventually they created their own kind of complex forms. I mean, with theology, for example, it's a joke that very few Christians actually understand the Athanasian formula of the Trinity, right?
I'm sure that's true.
Like, it's just like it's a mystery if you inquire too deeply. But I mean, it's the hinge of Orthodox Christianity, right? It's around which people will agree that they are Christians. So it's kind of interesting how things like that work out. But in terms of like the different religions, could you elaborate a little bit how Christianity and say later Islam arose out of the original monotheistic tradition of Judaism?
Yes. Well, the connection with the Judaism and Christianity is clearer, and we have somewhat more better historical information. So, Jesus was clearly an Orthodox Jew who had little evident intent of founding a new religion or of speaking to anyone other than Orthodox Jews. He was trying to make a tweak in Orthodox Judaism. And I think it's important to note that Jesus and Judaism at that time were in a particular language context, which was Aramaic. That was the language of the Near East at that time, Hebrew having being an extinct language even then. Now, Christianity took root not in Aramaic, but in the Greek speakers of the Roman world, in the Hellenistic world. So in that transition between two very different cultures, so Christianity emerged. Now it's sort of linked to Judaism, but it has many very non-Judaic ideas, such as the resurrection of a god,
sure.
Of drinking the god's blood, which is an idea that's anathema in Judaism. We're not allowed to drink.
Is that from Mithraism?
Well, I think it's sort of we can see that generically all these ideas would have been very familiar to Mithraism and to the other mystery cults that were growing in popularity in the Roman world. So Christianity really is a very deft splicing of the central ideas of these sort of mystery cults with Judaism. So it's grafted onto Judaism, even though its sort of central ideas have little in common with it, including especially the idea of Jesus as a god, and that comes from the mystery cult side, not from the Judaic side. So Jews regard Jesus as being as a human prophet, and this whole Trinitarian dogma of the Athanasian Creed, that too is a sort of very non-Judaic idea, and I think you can see a sort of split between the immediate followers of Jesus, sometimes referred to as Ebionites, or the Church of Jerusalem, most of whom sort of perished in AD 70 when the Romans razed Jerusalem to the ground. This particular aspect of this Jesus cult sort of just believed Jesus was an ordinary mortal, and there's an important difference between that and the form of Christianity that was eventually adopted by the Roman Empire as the official state religion. That is the one in which Jesus is regarded as a god. So these two forms of Christianity, well, I think there must be many forms of Christianity that competed with each other, and we just see the winning one, and that was the one that sort of compiled the New Testament and very artfully arranged it so that the lives of Jesus come first and the letters of Paul come second, whereas chronologically it was exactly the other way around. It's the letters of Paul that are the earliest Christian documents, and I think they reflect the fact that Christianity is to some large extent a creation of Paul, who saw that Judaism, if it were made to appeal to a much wider audience, if it dropped its sort of tribal trappings of circumcision and diet, could become a very powerful religion. So Paul is the sort of creator of Christianity, but very cleverly grafted it onto Judaism, so it would seem to have ancient roots.
So what you're talking about here is kind of it's almost an evolutionary narrative in terms of culture, right? I mean, because we're talking about the faith instinct, and we were talking about evolution and biology earlier, and now we're talking about the difference between, say, Pauline and Petrine Christianity and the Ebionites and the Church of James, and it's like this is just straight history. So it's a little perhaps surprising to people who are conditioned to separate these disciplines. So, how would you say that this would be relevant to the idea of a faith instinct? Because my thought would be okay, well, this is obviously cultural adaptation, right? Like selection and variation are still dynamics. It's just not biological. What would you say to that?
Well, I think the underlying theme of the book is that religions adapt themselves to a society's needs. So I try and show how Judaism came into being as a way of justifying the resurgence of a Jewish state, one that sort of invoked the myth of David and Solomon to justify the idea that the inhabitants of Judah, the then surviving Judaic kingdom, should try and recapture the northern kingdom of Israel that had been conquered by the Assyrians. So Judaism was sort of shaped for this immediate political agenda, and then of course after. Well, it inspired the Jews to conduct 3 very dangerous but almost successful revolts against the Roman Empire, in one of which they destroyed a whole Roman legion. And then after they were crushed into submission, very interesting that the religion again adapted. The rabbis sort of recast Judaism into a sort of very cohesive doctrine for people who were constantly at the mercy of the whims of their hosts. So it became an entirely pacific religion from having been the opposite. So all this, I think, supports the thesis that religion is so important to survival that it is constantly being adapted to a society's needs.
Okay. That sounds like, so, would you say that goes with Durkheim's idea that religion is an expression or just kind of a reflection of a society?
Yes, I think Durkheim's ideas are central. So all I've really tried to do in the book is to sort of graft Darwin and Durkheim together.
Okay. Because when you're talking about primitive religion, or just from small-scale societies, intuitively it makes sense that their religion would be as you would describe them, right? And then when you're talking about, say, the Roman Empire, intuitively you can see how Christianity is the way it is, right? And so it's like each religion basically the religious trait here seems to be reflecting the underlying society, right? Or the culture.
Yes, that's right, because religion is the best kind of sort of social glue we have. So each society tries to get the glue into the right shape for whatever its ecological needs may be. So if you're running an empire like the Roman emperor, you see that traditional Roman religion doesn't have any hold on people. You sort of cast around for one religion after another, and then the best sort of alternative is Christianity, so you adapt Christianity into the imperial creed.
Okay, so one thing I would say, though, is, like, I mean, that's obviously correct, and, you know, say in the late 3rd century, you know, like, the solar religion got really popular, and, I mean, that's where December 25th became a really popular festival, Natalis Sol Invictus, right? The birth of the invincible sun, which later became Christmas. So, I mean, we're seeing here a pattern. I mean, it's obviously a cross-cultural pattern where many, like, larger political units require a unifying religion. But, I mean, would you say that the specific content in terms of philosophy or theology, would you say that's relatively incidental?
I think it is relatively incidental. I mean, the leaders of religion simply have to find the sort of the symbols that work, that are emotionally attractive, and that perform whatever purpose it is society is up against.
Yeah. Okay. I just wanted to get that out there. So, in terms of group cohesion and you know, the history of religion, I really want to touch upon real quickly. You had a very interesting section on the rise of Islam, which presents, I guess you could say, heterodox. I mean, I don't know if you would want to characterize it that way. Heterodox scholarship on how Islam arose, and probably this will be very surprising to many viewers. So, do you want to give a really quick synopsis?
Sure. So I was trying to look at the historical background in which each of the 3 monotheisms arose. So scholars have been working for centuries on the background in which Judaism emerged from the religion of the early Canaanites, and also a great lot of work has been done on Christianity. But I think scholarship is somewhat with Islam. So most scholars, I think, accept that the traditional Islamic writings contain historical truths about Islam, and if they apply the historians' methods to these materials, they will be able to come up with a reasonable history of Islam. Now, there's a small group of scholars that has only just started work who have, as you say, a very heterodox view of the beginnings of Islam. It is not accepted by the majority of scholars, so I think its status should be regarded as a hypothesis. But it's a very interesting hypothesis because it takes the view that, well, we should start from independent sources, historical, numismatic, whatever we have, and we should see what we can reconstruct from these independent sources, and then we should turn to Islamic writings and see which of them and how much we wish to accept. So this seems to be a perfectly sort of reasonable methodology, and the proof of the pudding is in the eating. So given that this is a hypothesis, the hypothesis goes more or less as follows, which is that, well, it's built around the date of 622, which is 622 AD, which of course is the beginning of Islam with Muhammad's movement from Mecca to Medina. So these historians say, well, 622 was also a very important date for another reason, which has kind of been lost sight of, and this was the date at which Arabs gained their independence. Yeah. So previous to this time, in the seventh century, there was a long campaign between the Byzantine Empire, centered at Constantinople in present-day Turkey, and the Sassanid Empire that was in present-day Iran. And these two warring empires had Arab buffer states between between them. So the Byzantines contained the Ghassanid dynasty in Syria, and the Sassanids contained the Lakhmid dynasty more or less in Iraq. Now, in 622, the Byzantine general Heraclius defeated the Sassanids under their general Shahrazad in a great battle, following which the Sassanid Empire more or less disintegrated. But the Byzantines, instead of holding on to these captured buffer states, they also were overextended. So Heraclius just took the Byzantine Empire back and drew its lines much further toward the west. So these two buffer states were now on their own. Now, their religion was Christian, so the Ghassanids were mostly Trinitarian Christians of various kind, and the Lakhmids were Nestorian Christians.
Yeah. So
the ruler who emerged as, who put these two states together, who's called Muawiyah, who is the fourth or fifth caliph in traditional history. Muawiyah, in the view of the revisionists, was the first Arab ruler. And he was naturally a Christian like his subjects, and he was looking for a unified religious faith, just like the Roman emperors were for their empire. Muawiyah was looking for a unified faith that would bring together all the Christian Arabs under his rule. So he chose a form of Christianity that had been sort of nurtured in the Syriac church, and it held a view of Jesus that was very similar to the one we just described, held by the Ebionites. It viewed Jesus as a human prophet and an ordinary mortal. And Muawiyah found this idea of a single prophet and Jesus being an ordinary man and there being a single God as a very attractive religion to bring all his subjects together, and also to oppose to the Trinitarian view of the Byzantine Empire, who was his rival.
Yeah.
So that is how Islam essentially began. It was a Christian sect adapted by Muawiyah and his eventual successor Abdul Malik.
Yeah.
And its principal place of worship was the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem, and it was later Arabized when the Umayyad dynasty that Muawiyah founded was taken over by the Abbasids, and it was the Abbasids who then moved the center of worship from Jerusalem to Mecca and who Arabized Jesus into Muhammad. That essentially is the revisionist position, but it remains to sort of be tested by scholars, both Western and Islamic.
Yeah, definitely need to give some links for that for readers, because I mean I've heard about this before, and it's usually pretty surprising to most people, because the historical critical lens hasn't really been applied to Islam very much. Which, like, in Christianity, there are obviously evangelical conservatives who have a traditional Orthodox view on things, and then there are liberals who there are people who consider themselves Christians in positions of clerical authority who might not believe that Jesus was even the Son of God, correct? I mean, like, the historical critical method has really revised a lot of the empirical understanding of the Christian past. And with Islam, the Orthodox view could be true, or could it be, or might not be true, but the historical critical method really hasn't been applied, right?
I think that's correct, yes. So,
it needs to be tested, and it'll be interesting. Definitely there are, the hypothesis, didn't emerge in a vacuum. There are gaps, and we're pretty excessively reliant on, like, a particular line of sources, right? Particular hadiths and whatnot. So we'll see how that goes. Before we finish, I would like to talk about the future, I guess. In your definition earlier of religion, you seem to be referring to gods. And near the end of the book, you talk about the future of religion, and it seems that you were suggesting that perhaps religion could take a form that's post-supernatural. Is that a correct characterization or not?
Well, I argue that because we have the religious instinct built into us, into our neural circuitry, that religions are likely to endure.
Yeah.
So then the question is, for our increasingly sort of secular Western societies, in which many people find it hard to believe in the concept of the supernatural, believe in the concept of God, can there be sort of religions without God?
Yeah.
Because this sort of may be the direction in which religions have to go.
Yeah.
And I just don't know the answer to the question. Now, there are religions without God, and Buddhism formally has no gods, but in practice it does have a lot.
Yeah. And Jainism too, I think.
I'm sorry?
And Jainism too, I think.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so, I've looked at, it seems to me that, from what my experience is, most Western practitioners of Buddhism, most converts, are actually, they worship their religion is without God, right? But if you look at how Buddhism is practiced in societies where the majority of people are Buddhist, it's basically a theistic religion, you know?
Right.
So, I think I remember, to me, one of the more interesting events was in 2004 when the tsunami happened in Sri Lanka. The Buddhist farmers who lived inland, I remember reading in the New York Times that they ascribed the fact that the Muslim fishermen on the coast that had such high fatality rates to the fact that they didn't believe in Lord Buddha. Oh. Which I think Western Buddhists would be a little surprised. But in any case, it just that seems to show that religion, even if theology is incidental, there are general broad outlines, family resemblances, where no matter what the people at the top say, it will converge onto. And reading your section on primitive religions and the importance of dance and music and just communal ritual, and also and what you were saying later about individual relationships, it seems in some ways American religion is becoming more, quote, primitive, with like the rise of Pentecostalism and all sorts of other extremely emotional, charismatic religions, and the rise of just the importance of the individual in religious practice in the United States, the personal relationship to Jesus. I've talked to people that are born again Christians who refuse the term Christian because they don't consider themselves followers of a church. They believe in Jesus. You see what I'm saying? And so it seems to me that what you're seeing in the United States, and perhaps in much of the West, is just a decay of the power of the institutions that arose with agriculture. But most people aren't necessarily becoming atheists, right? They're just they're recreating social forms on a smaller scale or a more personal form, or personal scale is what it looks like to me. And so, if I had to bet, that seems like I guess I'll post a link to this. I looked at social science data in Europe. There's variation in terms of how religious people are across societies, but with secularization, a greater number of people say that they believe in a higher spirit than become atheists, right? So it seems like the higher spirit people are actually the ones gaining and not atheism. Although, like a substantial number of say, Swedes are atheists, but, with the decline of Christianity, not everyone is becoming an atheist. More people are just becoming kind of freelance theists, I guess. And so that might be in the future at some point. East Asia has a different model, right? Where it's like institutional religion has always been weaker. So perhaps it would be something like that. It's not necessarily an atheistic society, there are religions, but you don't have one religion looming over everybody like we have in the West, which is, you didn't touch upon the Eastern religions very much in your book, right? Just because of space.
Right, I couldn't cover everything, and I figured most of my readers would probably belong to one or other of the three monotheisms. But the Eastern religions are, of course, just as important. I wonder if some Eastern populations are perhaps more homogeneous, and therefore they don't sort of depend on religion so strongly as European societies do to hold people together. But that's just a conjecture on my part. I think you're right.
We could do a cross-cultural test with the overseas Chinese.
Yes, that would be very interesting.
Yeah. So maybe I'll look that data up. One last thing that I want to say, we got about 5 minutes left, But have you seen the movie Avatar?
No, I haven't yet. Okay,
so your description of primitive religion is basically is pretty straightforwardly described in the movie Avatar in a lot of ways.
Oh, that's fascinating.
Yeah, so it's down to a T. But obviously he was drawing on real cultural anthropology, so it's not super surprising, but I thought it was interesting as you were talking, because I watched the movie yesterday, and it's a very, very, I don't know, I guess you would say it's a spiritual movie. The plot is pretty predictable, but just in terms of communal rituals and religion and animism, it's all in there. So is there anything else you would like to say, Nick?
No, I think we've covered most of the ground, so I've enjoyed it very much, and thank you so much for these very penetrating questions.
Okay, I'll talk to you later, Nick.
Look forward.
Bye.